Good afternoon, everybody. It's Friday, the 19th of February, 2021. You're here at Lunch and Learn. We've got a pretty busy agenda for today. We have some questions and a couple of maps that were submitted by Diane. And Diane, we will be getting to those today. However, we're going to start off with Richard talking about some more of the research he's done and data he's explored, specifically looking at trauma. So he'll get everybody unmuted, and then we'll turn it over to Richard, who will start with presenting his information, and that should take us maybe 15 or 20 minutes, he anticipates. And then Diane, you are first up. So we'll get to you, Diane D, since we have several Dianes and Dianas in here. Diane D, you'll be first up right about half past the hour. All right, okay. Richard.
Okay, is my chart visible?
Your chart, ANX only versus ANX with depression.
Yeah, you got it. That's right. Okay, well, as all of you know, in the NewMind database, we have over 1 million maps. It's exponentially growing. It's beyond that. We have literally hundreds of thousands of ISIs and everything else. And we internally, according to HIPAA and NIH standards, we clean the data, so we only see data only, and then we process it internally for enhancement of the database system. But we also share some of it publicly, and again, all under the NIH approved rubrics. And so since I've retired from clinical work a lot, I do a lot of data analysis because I have one of the largest databases in the world, actually, ironically. And I have it there to play with. So what I've been looking at is how do we make sense of the data? And I have 60 pages of statistical notes I made over last year, and I'm putting those into a book, which will be available to everybody in NewMind, free of charge, obviously, for useful information to know what's going on going forward, because in a sense, you all contribute to it. And the angle I have taken from the beginning, and I still do, is that anxiety and depression are fundamental to all mental disorder. And something that I think Rob and Martin and I have in common, and I don't know about Judy, she probably does too, but particularly Martin and I, we've discussed this, is that we're big Hans Selye fans and Herbert Benson fans, and that ultimately all mental disorder has its basis in being triggered by chronic exposure to fear, and the fear response and the consequences of that. And that was heavily researched in the 70s and 80s in psychology. A lot of it's been forgotten, sadly, because it is more than applicable. Herbert Benson's work at Harvard continues on, and showing that stress, the silent killer, because most people aren't aware of how much they have, in the same sense that heart attacks kill more people because they aren't aware they have high blood pressure, because high blood pressure is a high silent killer, and it's related to heart attacks. And if we go to the medical literature, most mental disorder and physical disorder has its basis in toxic stress and trauma in the early developmental years, and that's been really well established. So I think that's why we often say, oh, well, we gotta, one of the best things to do with people is to calm them down. Martin used the aeronautic version, spooling down, which came from the terminology for spooling down your jets, and that's really what we need to achieve. And if you look at Bessel van der Kolk, he says in all his research, and I agree with him 1000%, that really the trick is to get people into a profoundly calm state while they recall the trauma, and that in that moment, most people are able to integrate the trauma, but it requires a special sauce, and van der Kolk readily admit it takes every technique you've got to make it work, and he will use anything, neurofeedback, EMDR, anything he can find, because not any one technique works with everybody. And of course, we should expect that. Not one drug works with anybody, not one protocol works with everybody. There's not a one size fit all for the human race, not one religion, not one philosophy, one economic system, not one sexual orientation. That's just not how we're built as human beings. So anxiety and depression is at the core of all these things. So the NewMind system was built to track that from the ground up, and all of the assessment tools are built around that. And so what I'm doing is I'm going through and looking at how does anxiety and depression, I've got a measure of it, my own personal measure, which I believe is better than the Beck inventory and have the data to prove it, is that anxiety and depression affects health. We know that from the ACE study. So we have a physiology checklist to correlate with it. And we know that affects EEG. So we have the database system to check with it. But I don't use the database system. I use the raw EEG values because that's more accurate and reliable. And then we have symptom tracking and protocol tracking. So we can look at anxiety and depression and computerized performance tests. It's the effect of anxiety and depression on performance. And we know, again, from the literature, and it's pretty well established science, that the cortex can't work right if the emotional brain is not working right. And I have to keep saying that because people seem to lose track of it, particularly if they're coming on board to NewMind. It's amazing how many people in the mental health community do not know that. They also do not know that a thyroid problem can cause depression, which you can't talk away. It's still amazing. And I've been to the American Counseling Associations. I've been to all those meetings, and I'm appalled by the level of knowledge. And so was Jane Myers, who was chair at Greensboro counseling department before she passed, and was a real advocate of getting people in counseling up to speed on all these things. So my approach to organize this data is around theories of anxiety and depression. So the whole first part of my analysis is the ISI. What dimensions in the ISI correspond to anxiety and depression? We see things and we think we're seeing things, and Rob and I and Diana down at my clinic, we for years we've looked at those things and go like, yeah, we see the same things and we agree. Diana and I look at it and she's coming to the same conclusions I am. But Diana's in a minority of counselors, like a lot of you. She actually has a biopsychosocial approach. As a consequence, I want to know, how does it affect behavior? How does it affect physiology? So I'm finishing up the chapter on the ISI, and then I have a whole chapter on how anxiety and depression influence physiology statistically. What's the relationship? And then we'll be doing one on computerized performance. But I also have one on EEG, and the findings are sometimes counterintuitive. And you've been getting leaked the information constantly for a year and a half, 2 years now. And I'm doing that because for some of you, this is really useful information you'll grasp right away. Ultimately, the book will be out probably by year's end, and you'll have all this data in one place. But I thought that this was very interesting because it supported my hypothesis about anxiety and depression based on the literature and physiology and what I'd been reading and what I'd seen clinically and in the MAP system. And that is that depression is end-state anxiety, and that's fully supported in the physiology literature. It's taking a long time to leak down to the psychology community, but they're not big on physiology. But it does jibe with a major paradigm in psychology called the diathesis stress, and that is that we have genetic vulnerabilities that are all different, and that stress, hand salye, distress, not eustress, distress, can trigger over time. It can fracture our physiology and our psychology along the fault lines of our genetic polymorphisms, to put it simply. And goes all the way back to early studies with monozygotic twins. We knew this. So looking at anxiety, it is a state that ultimately in chronic form depletes the human system, degrades it, and will kill you. And it will kill you because it will lead to depression. Depression is the second or third biggest killer in the world, according to the WHO, after heart disease, another silent killer. So the end state of anxiety is depression, suicidal ideation, and if you don't do it yourself, your system will usually collapse on you in the form of bad health, physical health. And that's the underlying bedrock for the whole NewMind perspective. So just to show you, I took a sample of almost 3,000 people out of the NewMind database system and from clinics all over the United States. This is a better sample than most people in government studies and so forth get, because it's from clinics all over the United States, and it's a very large sample size. And I've done larger sample sizes, and it's the same story. But there's something called the central limit theorem in statistics. When your sample size gets big enough and representative, no matter how many times you repeat it, you'll get the same information, which is where I am with the database system. So in this chart, real quick, we have looking at people with anxiety only. So they are not reporting any significant depression in the ISI, only anxiety, and that's the blue line. And the orange line is people reporting depression and anxiety. And what you see here is interesting because we have people reporting no anxiety or depression, subclinical, which the Beck doesn't measure and we do, low clinical, mid clinical, and high clinical. All right, these numbers are the mean scores on the ISI. So they have relevance to you if you're looking at the ISI for each of these things. So if you look at anxiety, the mean scores at subclinical are 13, mean score for low clinical is 19, mean score for mid is 22, high is 22. You're like, well, wait a second, how come high drops out for anxiety? It's still 22. This is very interesting because there are no scores in anxiety without depression that exceed 22. Anxiety measures never go above 22 in the ISI unless there's depression present. And that begins to tell you something. When people get up close to 22, 23, their depression symptoms start to dominate. And I have other stats to show that, but it's too complex for one chart. If you look at the depression, the anxiety scores for subclinical are down to 11. Well, those are both in subclinical range. But when you get to low anxiety levels, your depression scores are still in the subclinical range. And when you get to mid-anxiety, you're still in subclinical range on depression. It's not till you get to 22 that suddenly you're in a clinical range, and it ramps up pretty fast. So when you're going from mid to high anxiety, your depression starts to ramp up very quickly, and then anxiety by itself disappears. And I believe, based on this data, that's what it's telling us is what we've always thought we were seeing, is that, Rob and Diana and I, as we talked about these things, is that once you reach a certain level of anxiety, you're creating so much inflammatory process and your sleep is so bad that you're losing serotonin because of the pro-inflammatory response, and depression takes over. And I think this data bears it out, and it supports all of this research. And the only people who ever reach scores above 25 on average on the ISI in anxiety, always, every one of them has depression, severe depression. And I think that, again, supports the notion that depression for human beings is an antidote to anxiety in a sense. That the concept that Davidson developed in the 80s and 90s, that depression, and he was very prescient on this, that depression creates a withdrawal state that we tend as social creatures to withdraw from the social interaction as depression develops is a way of protecting us socially from continually re-traumatizing ourselves. And it is the concept of complex trauma is re-traumatization. It's continuous re-traumatization, and it doesn't have to be big. It just has to be constant in that it undermines your trust. It violates your trust. And if you're a child, you're bonding. So it's a violation. And once that's violated, your relationships, all of them, become highly questionable. The other thing it does is it destroys your self-esteem, and it makes you feel powerless. And so complex trauma, unlike just PTSD, is ubiquitous in our culture, and it's more a matter of degree than do you have it. And I think that's the elephant in the room for neurofeedback, because we get people, they come in and they say, I'm not stressed. Well, most people don't have a clue. Scientifically, it's not likely they would ever know unless you assess them. Second of all, almost nobody is aware of their level of trauma, and they don't have a clue until they hit the wall. The marriage falls apart, their business falls apart, their friends leave them, they become addicted, what have you. Or their health is so bad they can't carry on. So once we get to that level of complex trauma, they show up in your office. So my rule of thumb is when anybody shows up in my office, they're guilty until proven innocent of complex trauma. And I mean, I'm talking about a significant level. And I don't see that attitude in enough clinicians, and they get bushwhacked by this all the time. They'll do a protocol and the person will abreact and they'll think it's the protocol. And I can almost guarantee you that's not the case. A healthy person, you can run any protocol you want anywhere in the brain, and for the most part, they'll be fine. But if they have any complex trauma, it'll come out eventually. Marjorie Tooman had an axiom: whenever you put an electrode on a body, trauma emerges. I think the woman was dead right. So I would say do not question the neurofeedback. I mean, obviously you might find a better protocol that doesn't push them so fast, but what you're doing is you're pushing their brain into a normalization pattern so fast that the trauma's emerging and they can't cope with it. And so they have agitations, problems with sleep, they have suicidal ideation, they have a whole host of symptomology that's related to anxiety. And as I've told you, go to the FDA website on anxiety. The abreactions to relaxation are profound, and the list is long, and in it are things you would never imagine. So, from my little bully pulpit here on the soapbox, I would really just always expect complex trauma to be present. And I'd like, today we'll probably end up talking a bit about it when we look at these maps and these protocols, but I would like to continue in the weeks ahead talking about this topic, because I don't think we've discussed it enough with respect to neurofeedback, and it might bind together some of the confusion. And I'd love to hear what your opinions are of complex trauma. And many of you are very versed in this. How you deal with it? How do you assess with it? How does it manifest for you? Or are you getting bushwhacked by it? So,
Richard,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt here. I hope this is not recorded. Martin, just to confirm, what I'm looking at here are the ISI ratings. Is that correct? Okay.
ISI only.
Yeah. Thank you.
ISI only, independent of EEG. Yep.
Okay.
That's very reliable data because of that. So, given that's the case, that we have this issue that we're all dealing with, complex trauma, and we keep thinking it's our protocol that's eliciting this. One of the problems we have, for those of us in the counseling and psychology community who know this research and who know this well, like Rob's been dealing with it since the 70s and writing about his books on it. They didn't call it that back then, but it's there. Unless you have worked in a behavioral health hospital or an outpatient clinic, I don't think you really get complex trauma. I really don't think I would be surprised if anybody really does. Because my experience is you think, oh, I can talk people out of this, or, oh, if I can just relax them enough, or, oh, if I just use the right protocol, I can resolve this. And if you've worked in a behavioral health hospital, you know that's an illusion. There are people who are so damaged because it changes their brain, and it takes months, sometimes years, to regrow your brain back to normal if you've been raised with toxic stress and complex trauma. And Rob's got lots of data on that he shows. So you're not going to fix complex trauma right away with neurofeedback or with drugs or anything. It's a very slow, gradual process to recover it, which I know flies in the face of our desperate need for immediate gratification in our society, and our fantasy that we can fix anything with technology tomorrow. But this, if you've encountered truly broken people, it's a fantasy that you're just going to calm people down and fix them. It's not going to happen like that. It's something that they have to work at and you have to work at sometimes for years. And I think any good trauma therapist knows that. So that's my soapbox for the day, and I'm open to any questions, and maybe we can get into the map.
Richard, what I would add to that is, having worked in a behavioral health hospital, you're so right. And I remember being on the unit, and unfortunately the girls unit was right there on the road, and it was where all the emergency vehicles went by, and they were so traumatized from being in neighborhoods with gang shootings and all that, that every time they heard a siren, they went and freaked out. And you could try every technique you learned in every single class to calm them down, and all you could expect was if they felt threatened by you, they would just assault you.
Yes, absolutely.
That was it.
That was
so you always had to keep a distance. You trying to touch them to calm, and all that stuff went to hell in a handbasket. And that was that. And I wanted to also add, I think when you see these people, like in the last part of this, the high chart, where they both have depression and anxiety, that those are the folks I think tend to just flip back and forth. One day they can come in and see and they're okay. One day they're stressed out. The next day they're sad and moody. I mean, they're all over the globe. They're hard to predict.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Rob. And I can actually probably tease that out from the data, and I should. Somebody else also suggested I should do this by age, and I will too as well. But when you get, I think when you get up to those scores of 22, when you get into high levels of depression and anxiety, that's when you see them just getting stuck in the depression, severe depression.
Yeah. And the worse the stress is going on in their lives, the worse that depression gets.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
It just pushes them further and further and further along. It's I see this a lot.
Right. For your garden variety complex trauma, neurofeedback is probably one of the most powerful tools out there to recover people. It still takes time. It's not, here's your pill, good luck, and hey, I feel great today because I'm drugged. And that's going to cost you survival points in the long run. But, good neurofeedback, standard neurofeedback in a few months can do amazing things. But if you've got somebody with complex trauma and they don't know it and you don't know it, you're going to be undermined every step of the way and scratching your head and running around trying to buy new equipment or get new protocols or going to new workshops. And really what's happening is you're dealing with trauma. All that's happening. It's not, you can't fix it overnight when it's like that. It takes more time. It takes a lot of effort. It's not easy.
This conversation is very exciting to me because every time I look at somebody, I'm looking for fear and reactivity as I'm talking to them.
Yes.
Because it's so prevalent. It is just so prevalent. And it's something that's happened for me in my clinical practice for years and years. And to watch you put it together with, a more intellectual view to see it so that you can we have these instincts, and then we couple it with the data and the information, and there's so much that gets explained. You know, I was numbers of time doing some very standard neurofeedback and do it for a while and not get anywhere. You think you're getting somewhere and you're not, and then realize it's all this complex trauma, the fear and reactivity they're stuck in. So it's very exciting. And I agree with you, we don't talk about it enough here because it's plaguing all of our people, I think.
Don't you think it's a topic, Judy, that's been growing since, maybe 2012, 2015? We're hearing of it more. It's kind of a new concept in some ways, the term.
I think that it's the road home for people. As we know more and more about using neurofeedback to treat complex trauma, we are going to take more people to freedom than ever, because if it'll work with the people with complex trauma, what we do, it'll work with all the others, you know?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I've recovered people with multiple personality disorder who've been tortured in children by religious cults. I mean, women who were given away to the Catholic priests on a regular basis, to please them as children. And when you're working at clinical work, you deal with people who lived in the basement, who got food thrown down to them, were ignored, and nobody's ever said they were anything but bad. I mean, it's horrific what goes on behind these quiet neighborhoods. And you don't know about it till you're a clinician. Nobody out there in America understands what's underneath the dark seam,
Dr. Soutar, can I make a comment?
Yeah, sure.
So 2 of my clients today, both sexually abused in their younger ages, and then one of them was in the Air Force and was abused by her psychiatrist that she was sent to, sexually abused, and classic complex PTSD. And I met with both of them today virtually, and one of them described, she had something happen. I won't get into the details, but she said she called me yesterday during a meltdown up in North Carolina, and she said it was like an anaconda. She could feel it, she could see it coming, and it was like writhing and going around her body, starting at her neck and going down her body. And she said it was just constricting my lungs so that I couldn't breathe. And she said it felt so heavy. And that was when she was triggered, her inability to integrate her sensations and take an emotional context to say, I'm going to be okay. She had a lot of trouble doing that. So sensory integration is a big issue. But it's just her terminology is how she described it, that she could see it coming and she was nothing she could do about it. And it felt like a big anaconda wrapping itself around her. So I thought that was very, very.
That is a really neat description, and that does how it is kind of how it feels viscerally. And you are powerless because you're dissociating, and people who are complex trauma, whenever they're triggered, they dissociate and they don't have their full faculties to bring forth to deal with it. They can't be creative. And so they respond automatically, and it's always in a failed routine. Whereas if they, with neurofeedback, if you can get them so that they have a calmer baseline and they get triggered, they have that space between the stimulus and their response to creatively respond for a moment. They're aware, they're in the moment. And that's really new to us in the West to some degree, but in Tibetan Buddhism, I want to tell you, the Rinpoches talk in detail about that. I mean, it's not new to them, it's 1,000 years old. And so they have a very developed psychology, and we're not the first to notice this. And shamans talk about it too, but in different terms. We're just rediscovering it in psychology in modern times.